The chains rattled louder than the wind. They dragged across the dirt yard of the ranch as two men shoved her forward, her bare feet stumbling in the dust. She did not cry out, whatever tears she once had were stolen long ago, but her body carried the weight of humiliation, as if each step ground her further into the earth. Behind her, a little girl clutched her father's vest, her small voice breaking through the heavy silence. "Daddy, is she dying?" The rancher said nothing. He stood with his jaw locked, eyes fixed on the woman slumped against the fence post. Her hair hung loose and matted, strands sticking to the raw marks on her cheeks. A deep burgundy dress, torn and frayed, clung to her as though it, too, had endured punishment. The ropes binding her chest and arms pressed cruelly into her skin, leaving her breath shallow and uneven. The men laughed, said she was payment, said she was nothing but trouble, a burden to be rid of. They mocked her silence, called her nameless, claimed she had been discarded by one town and would surely be discarded again. Then they turned to the rancher, their sneering faces daring him to argue. He did not. He simply stared. The girl pressed closer, eyes wide as moons. The woman's knees buckled, her body sagging against the rough wood of the corral. Horses inside shifted nervously, their ears flicking at the sound of her strained breathing. Dust rose and settled in the dimming light, the whole scene suspended between cruelty and choice. The rancher reached for his knife. No words, just the sharp hiss of steel sliding from its sheath. The men stiffened, hands hovering near their belts. For a heartbeat it seemed blood would soak the ground. But the knife did not turn toward them. Instead, he stepped forward and cut the ropes. They snapped loose, falling limp against the woman's side. She swayed, nearly collapsing, but caught herself on the post. Her wrists were raw, angry red welts wrapped around them like brands. For the first time, her eyes lifted. They found his, dark and searching, unreadable yet steady. The men spat into the dirt. One muttered that he was a fool, that mercy had no place in these lands. They mounted their horses and rode off, laughter trailing thin, as smoke until it vanished into the prairie. Silence returned, thicker than before. The woman stumbled forward. The little girl darted away from her father's side, a tin cup of water clutched in her hands. She held it up with both arms, her small voice quivering. "Here, drink." The woman hesitated, lips cracked, throat working as though speech had long deserted her. At last she took the cup, water spilling down her chin as she drank. It dripped onto the dirt, darkening patches of dust. She wiped her mouth with trembling fingers, then lowered her head, unable to hold the gaze of either child or man. Inside the cabin, she was given no questions, no interrogation. A chair, a blanket, the smell of bread cooling on the table. She perched as though expecting to be struck for breathing too loudly. Her hands folded into her lap, knuckles white from clutching herself together. The girl returned a second time, arms full of cloth. She set it gently across the woman's lap, a pale blue dress, small but clean, the kind a child might wear on a Sunday morning. Her voice carried innocent certainty. Mama said every soul should have something clean to wear. The woman froze. Her eyes stung. She had been denied softness for so long that the touch of kindness scalded. Tears slid down her cheeks unbidden, and she tried to cover them with her hands, ashamed of their betrayal. In a whisper she spoke, her name, brittle as a broken reed, almost lost to silence. The girl tilted her head, listening, but her father's heavy boots sounded on the porch before either could linger on the word. Night fell. The prairie turned black and endless, stars glittering like cold fire above the cabin roof. The rancher stood outside, hat low, hands braced on the railing, as if steadying himself against a storm no one else could see. Behind him, through the open door, he caught a glimpse of a woman. She sat rigid, the pale dress draped across her knees. The child was curled asleep against her side, one small hand gripping the fabric as though to claim it for both of them. The man's jaw clenched. Tomorrow the whispers would begin. Neighbors would question why he sheltered a woman who arrived in chains. They would call him reckless, foolish, maybe worse. But tonight he could not turn her out. Not after the sight of rope burns carved into her skin. Not after hearing his daughter's voice ask the question that still echoed in his chest. He looked again through the doorway. The woman's eyes had lifted from the blanket and were meeting his across the dim room. No words passed. Only the fragile truth of her presence, heavy with unspoken need, hanging between them. And for the first time, he wondered not if she was dying, but what it would take to help her live. The boom of a fist against the cabin door shattered the quiet morning. The woman startled, the dress she had been mending slipping from her lap to the floor. The child jolted awake from where she had been curled on a rug, eyes wide with sudden fear. Outside, voices rose, hard, bitter, unmistakable. The men had returned. The rancher moved with unhurried calm, though the air around him thickened. He opened the door and stepped into the pale light. The same riders waited in the dust, their horses restless, their mouths twisted with scorn. They demanded what they claimed was theirs. They spoke of debts unpaid, of shame that had to be settled. Their eyes slid past him to the figure hovering behind his shoulder, a shadow of a woman in a pale dress too small for her frame. He did not move aside. His voice, steady as stone, told them she would not be taken. One spat into the dirt, another laughed, but it was a brittle sound. The standoff stretched, long and taut. The little girl's hand found her father's sleeve, trembling. "Daddy, is she dying?" She whispered again, as though the words themselves were a charm to hold back the dark. "No," he said, "not this time. She's living now." Something in his tone unsettled the men. They shifted in their saddles, muttering curses, but at last they wheeled their horses and rode away, dust trailing behind like the tail of a storm. Their departure left silence heavy as a verdict. The rancher turned, his eyes meeting the woman's. She looked as if she might collapse, but she held herself upright, fingers clutching the frame of the door as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to earth. That night, she sat by the fire. The girl slept curled against her lap, trusting her presence without hesitation. The rancher sat across the room, the light flickering across his weathered face, his silence steady but watchful. At last the woman spoke. Her voice cracked, words scraping out like stones. She told them she had not spoken her name in years, that it had been stripped from her, beaten out of her, traded away, until it felt like nothing but an echo she barely remembered. The fire popped. The rancher did not push her. He simply waited, patient as the land itself. The girl stirred in her sleep, murmuring half-formed words, then settled again. The woman's hands shook. She pressed them together, then slowly, painfully, whispered the sound of her own name. It came fragile, hesitant, but real. The moment it left her lips, something shifted. The air in the cabin seemed to change, as though walls that had been closing in for years finally loosened. The rancher gave the smallest nod. It was not grand or dramatic, but it was an anchor, a recognition. Her name now belonged again to her, spoken into the firelight, carried by ears that would not twist it into shame. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, sleep came without dread. Days passed. She began to walk differently, her shoulders not so hunched. She fed the horses, kneaded bread alongside the girl, folded laundry with hands no longer shaking as much. The child's laughter trailed after her, filling corners of the cabin once hollow with silence. And though the rancher spoke little, she could feel his gaze sometimes, quiet as dawn, steady as a riverbank. But shadows have long memories. At dusk on the fifth day, hoofbeats thundered once more across the plain. The men returned, but this time they did not come to bargain with words. Their faces were harder, their threats sharper. They wanted her back, and they would not leave empty-handed. The rancher stood on the porch, gun at his hip, but before he could speak, the woman stepped forward. The pale dress fluttered against her legs. Her voice, raw yet unwavering, carried into the gathering dark. She spoke her name, louder now, with the weight of defiance. She claimed it in front of them, a banner against their cruelty. The men faltered, not because of the rancher's steel, but because the woman they had broken now stood unbroken before them. For a long moment no one moved. Then, with a mutter of disgust, they turned their horses. They left in silence this time, no laughter trailing behind, only the sound of hooves fading into distance. The woman swayed but did not fall. The rancher was beside her, steadying her without a word. The girl pressed herself against the woman's side, eyes glowing with relief. The night air felt charged, alive with the echo of what had just been reclaimed. And yet, as the last dust settled on the horizon, the rancher's gaze lingered there. He knew men like that did not give up easily. He knew their return had not been the end, but only a pause. Inside, the woman whispered her name once more, as if testing its strength. This time it held. Still, in the silence that followed, a question clung unspoken in the air. What price would be demanded next for the life she had just begun to claim?